Everyone is stuck inside right now, and a lot of MCU superfans are taking the opportunity to rewatch the films of their favorite franchise. But which movies are really essential? We think that there's 5 that are most worth a second look, and 5 where one viewing is more than enough. In deciding these, we took many factors into account. Does the movie move the MCU story forward? Does it invest us more deeply in the characters? Does it plant setups for satisfying payoffs later? And most importantly, is it a good movie on its own merits? All of those factored into our list. Join us as we run down 5 MCU movies that deserve a rewatch and 5 that don't. Our pick to kick off a great MCU rewatch is the movie that started it all. That's right, the original Iron Man. And we're not just picking it out of respect for being the first film. Not only does this movie perfectly introduce us to important MCU characters like Tony, Pepper, Jarvis, and the shapeshifter known as Rhodey, but it begins to shape the tone of the MCU for years to come. Iron Man is the perfect blend of action, comedy, and heart, a formula that the Marvel movies would ride to massive success in the coming decade.
Really? Yeah.
It is a great standalone movie, so it definitely passes our criteria in that regard. But how about the larger MCU? Well, the most important thing this movie does is set up the emotional arc of Tony Stark. By the end of Endgame, Tony is a father and someone who will sacrifice his life to save others. But that doesn't have nearly as much power if you haven't seen how far he's come. Tony starts the MCU as an awful person, but after being saved by Dr. Yinsen's sacrifice, he begins a journey that will eventually save the universe. The original Iron Man is the first piece of proof that maybe Tony Stark has a heart. Next up, the MCU followed up one of their best movies with one of their worst. Our first skippable candidate, The Incredible Hulk. Okay, let's look at our criteria again. Does The Incredible Hulk introduce characters and storylines that contribute to the MCU? Well, yes and no. It introduces Bruce Banner, but he's played by a different actor than in the later films, and mostly behaves like a very different person. Thunderbolt Ross returns for a series of small roles in Phase 2 and 3 movies, but it's not like your understanding of his character is deepened by having seen the Hulk. There's even some storylines that are teased but never really paid off, like Bruce's romance with Betty, and the creation of the leader. Watching this movie arguably makes the larger MCU worse, which brings us to our second criteria, which is if The Incredible Hulk is a good movie on its own. And we're sorry, we just don't see it. Full of dated effects, a dour, self-serious tone, and flat characters, we think The Incredible Hulk has a one-way ticket to Skipsville. Jumping back to the movies we deem worthy of a rewatch, we want to bring attention to the MCU movie that has aged the best, Captain America: The First Avenger. This movie's reputation seems to have only grown with time, and it was mostly dismissed by fans on its release. But the kind and decent spirit that defined Captain America is introduced here, in a fun and old-school adventure movie that captures the character perfectly. Not only is The First Avenger a good movie, but it interacts with the larger MCU in a myriad of ways. There's the introduction of Bucky and the setup for the Winter Soldier storyline, plus a supporting role for Howard Stark that hints at the birth of S.H.I.E.L.D., not to mention the strong foundation for Steve and Peggy's tragic romance, a setup that doesn't fully pay off until the final frame of Endgame. Speaking of Endgame, it's funny that Red Skull turned out to be such an important part of the Infinity Saga, as he was long thought of by fans as a dead-end storyline.
Schmidt believes he walks in the footsteps of the gods.
Instead, his demise became the longest withheld payoff in the entire MCU. Our next category for Skipstown is the first sequel in the MCU, and in our humble opinion, one of the worst. We speak, of course, to the fun but messy Iron Man 2. Let's take a look at our criteria. How does this movie help the larger MCU? Well, it introduces Black Widow, the War Machine armor, and for the most part, Nick Fury. Despite this, we feel that all of those characters are given better intros in later movies. There's lots of talk of the Avengers in Iron Man 2 and of Tony's eligibility, but most of that turns out to be unimportant in the grand scheme of things. The best setup the movie provides is that of the tumultuous relationship between Tony and his father.
This is the key to the future,
which is memorably paid off in Endgame. Still, we don't really think the rest of the movie is worth slogging through. Why is that? The movie is just kind of boring. The villain is uninteresting, the addiction plot is half-baked, and as we mentioned, the story stops several times for the characters to sit around and talk about the Avengers. Boring. We say skip. This one is maybe a little obvious, but how could we not include it? Our next pick to rewatch is, of course, the original Avengers. This movie rules. We still remember wondering if Marvel could really pull it off, and it still plays amazingly well after watching the Phase 1 build-up. There's so many fantastic payoffs, from watching the characters fight and test each other's powers to great character moments like Tony's heroic sacrifice and Hulk's face-off with Loki. The Avengers not only enhances the larger MCU, at the time, it proved that the Marvel movies could be enhanced by cross-continuity and not hurt by them, not to mention the countless storylines that rippled out from it. There was the Thanos tease, Tony's PTSD, and even storylines on Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. and the Netflix shows. R.I.P. There's a reason that Endgame returns to the climax of the Avengers. It's because it's still one of the best things Marvel has ever done. If your MCU rewatch does not include the Avengers, is it really a rewatch at all? Our next resident of Skipsburg is another sequel, the mediocre letdown known as Thor: The Dark World. The film had some behind-the-scenes problems, which may have led to the disappointingly average movie that ended up on screen. Namely, Wonder Woman director Patty Jenkins left the film 2 months into production, citing creative differences. In a recent interview with IndieWire, Jenkins described her original idea as a Romeo and Juliet-style space opera that would find Jane and Thor separated. That sounded pretty cool to us, honestly, and had to be better than what we ended up with, which was, for the record, Thor facing off against the most boring villain in the entire MCU, and some pretty weak comedic moments with Darcy and her intern. We know that Endgame calls back to some of Thor 2's biggest story moments, most notably the demise of Thor's mother, and that the movie effectively sets the stage for Thor Ragnarok. But do you really want to slog through 2 hours of boring dark elf stuff to get there? Yeah, we don't either. Welcome to Skipsburg, Dark World.
Anyone else?
Next on our tour of Rewatch City, we have one of the most underrated MCU films, Iron Man 3. Written and directed by action movie legend Shane Black, this movie brings the same perfect combo of action and comedy that Black brought to his films like Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and The Nice Guys. Iron Man 3 deepens the character of Tony Stark and finds him shaken after the events of the Avengers. Stricken with PTSD and faced with a new enemy, Tony has a full-blown identity crisis. Ultimately, the movie is about Tony's attempts to separate himself from the Iron Man armor. In Iron Man 2, Tony says, "I am Iron Man, the suit, and I are one." In Iron Man 3, he proves that he is Iron Man because of his intelligence, grit, and heroism. Now, besides alluding to Pepper's big suit-up moment in Endgame and a brief cameo at Tony's funeral, we won't lie and say that Iron Man 3 pays off a ton of stuff in other MCU films. If you ask us though, this underrated gem is worth revisiting just the same. Next up is maybe the president of Skiplandia, Ant-Man and the Wasp. Now, don't get us wrong, we don't think this movie has any big problems. We just think that in the grand scheme of things, it feels inconsequential. This movie has plenty of charm though. It's a more family-friendly story where the stakes are low and the main villain is healed instead of destroyed. Hannah John Kamen and Lawrence Fishburne give great performances that help add some weight. Otherwise, Ant-Man and the Wasp is a series of light punch-ups and broad comedy sequences that, while fun, doesn't leave much of an impression. Now, for our second criteria, the film sets up a few continuing threads. For one, it sets the stage for Ant-Man's appearance in Endgame, which becomes the inciting incident of that movie. But to be fair, this only happens in the after-credits scene of the film, which could easily be rewatched on YouTube. The whole thing happens mostly by coincidence. Aside from that scene, and a charming Walton Goggins performance, we don't see much worth revisiting here. Our last pick for being worthy of a rewatch is another underrated adventure, Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. At first glance, this movie may seem like an inferior retread of the first. It has similar aesthetics and jokes and uses most of the same characters. Still, on second viewing, Guardians 2 reveals a surprising layer of depth, especially after seeing Infinity War and Endgame. Not only does the movie provide further insights into the characters of Thanos, Gamora, and Nebula, but almost every member of the Guardians is given deeper characterization. Maybe not Drax and Groot, but still. Peter Quill's relationship with his father is investigated, and Rocket Raccoon's character development is some of the best in the entire MCU. Not only is the movie good on its own terms, but this character work adds context and further heartbreak to the Guardians' fate in Infinity War, and provides background to Nebula's role in Endgame. If you ask us, this journey around the universe is one worth taking again and again. Plus, it's a good refresher for Guardians 3, and might get you excited to see what director James Gunn does with Suicide Squad. Our final candidate to skip like a jump rope is a more recent entry into the MCU, Captain Marvel.
Take her down.
It's a confused origin story that doesn't do a great job of introducing its main character, even if actress Brie Larson does her best to save it. As a result of this identity crisis, the movie is kind of boring. It's about a character who doesn't know who she is, and is in no hurry to find out. There's some standout sequences, like the scenes where the Skrulls probe into Carol's memory, and the movie is full of great performances, but ultimately, it ends up unsatisfying. There are many ties to the MCU, but none of them make either the film or the larger universe more interesting. So the Tesseract was in Skrull custody for a while, so Ronan and Coulson show up for cameos, who cares? The Captain herself may have some great fight scenes in Endgame, but are any of them really improved by watching her solo adventure? For our money, we say no. Sorry, Captain, please don't hurt us. So, what do you think of our list? Are there movies in the MCU more worthy of skips? Are there any worth revisiting that we left out? Let us know in the comments below and subscribe to Screen Rant for more great Marvel content.